people still hide their fertility journey from people. They still don't talk about it openly because there's still very much views and opinions that are given to people based around that, often well thinking and, well meant, and, through an air of kindness there. But sometimes, because that whole emotional piece from being told, which we still have in schools, that you can get pregnant really easily, it doesn't catch up to the fact that when you're trying in your 30s and late 30s, that actually in most cases, if people aren't approaching this as if they were a project manager in terms of their life, their lifestyle, their health, looking at their genes and how they can actually improve the way their hormones are working, it does generally become one of those situations where they can add to that statistics themselves.
So welcome, Angela. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I can't wait to dive into today's topic, which is all things fertility.
So thank you for inviting me tomorrow. I really appreciate you taking some time out and us to have a chat about fertility and go into a bit more depth.
Yes, likewise. Do you know what? This topic, I was really excited to talk to you today about it because it's such a powerful topic, and it's such a sensitive topic for so many people, so many couples, and it really is something that should be discussed. It's really important, and I know the information that you have and all of the knowledge that you've gained with your clients is going to be so useful for people who are listening to this right now, and for anyone who is thinking about getting pregnant soon or maybe struggling. So I think it's just such an important conversation, and there's just so much to talk about. I have a list of questions which you've seen, but I've actually added to them this morning because I'm just in the car this morning. I was just like, oh my God, I really need to know about this as well. I need to know about that. So I'll try, and I won't keep you for too long. Feel free to cut me off whenever you want, but there's a lot to go through, basically. Like,
don't worry. It's such an important and emotive topic, because a lot of people who are in couples, they want to have children, and if they do, they start researching it, and then if they don't, get pregnant straight away, which we're all led to believe at school. If you sit next to a boy, if you're not on the pill, then you're going to get pregnant. It becomes a huge shock, and I think a lot of my clients go through that grieving process when they start coming to me, because they've actually been told for most of their life that it's actually something that can happen so easily. You have to be frightened about it. It's something to be careful about, be so measured about your approach with, being anywhere around potentially boys who may be able to get you pregnant. So, it is one of those things that I think, as part of being a nutritional therapist, you have to work through in terms of that emotional kind of response to having fertility issues, with them giving up that kind of notion that actually they're always going to be fertile, and as soon as they decide to have children, they can actually get that going straight away, and everything will be rosy. They'll move in with their partners, start to go down the route of trying, if they're a heterosexual couple, and then sort of move into having a baby and having the 2.4 children kind of approach. So it is incredibly difficult for a lot of the people, and there's often a lot of anguish and despair and worry and all of these kind of emotions, which are never really dealt with through that whole process of them having fertility issues, even all the way up to IVF, because no one says to them, actually you were sold a bit of a lie in terms of the fact that fertility is something that happens very easily, in terms of your own fertility, and that is going to happen quite easily, because it's something like 400 billion or trillion to one that we're actually sat here as adults actually having a conversation. So it's very, very difficult to actually get that sperm and egg meet situation to work. It's all about timing, and it's about possibly if there are any underlying issues with people.
And I remember the first time I learned that in your menstrual cycle, there's only like a tiny window where you can actually get pregnant. It's that 5-day kind of window, 20% of your cycle or something, that you can actually get pregnant. I remember the first time I learned that, I was like, whoa, it kind of blew my mind, because like you said, when we're young, we're led to believe, probably rightfully so by our parents, you know, they're just kind of like,
Mm.
don't get up to funny business because you could get pregnant, because, you know, absolutely your I can imagine parents wanting to instill that in their children from
Mm.
a young age, just to kind of make sure that they're careful. But we are led to believe that it can happen anytime and then it'll be easy, and none of us really expect it to be hard. And I
Mm.
think that's the anguish part, where it's like, I didn't know this would happen to me. Why is
Yeah.
this happening to me? And actually, this is one of the questions I had for you, because it's all good and well, you know, helping someone to lose weight or helping someone to balance their hormones. But when it comes to fertility, the emotions that come into your office must
Mm.
be turned up really high, and they're tough emotions. Like, people are relying on you to, you know, provide quite an important part of their life. So
Mm.
how is that for you?
Well, I think we're not really trained as nutritionists and, people providing integrative medicine sort of response to fertility approach to, functional medicine and all those things. The emotional side of things is something that you learn as part of coaching to support people as part of that. Because you can't just say, here's a diet, here's some supplements, off you go, jobs are good, and really on that situation. Because there is a big kind of part of what you do. There's three elements to it. There's diet and supplements, there's lifestyle, and there's the emotional side of things. If you don't deal with one third of that, then the kind of approach to positive, hopeful feelings that they are going to get pregnant and having that kind of more proactive view is very difficult. And also having that cushion if things go wrong, that actually it's easy for them to pull themselves back up and actually get on with the next stage of that. So, from the emotional point of view, it is, something that you definitely have to do extra training in, and you need more support, and you have to have that as part of your arsenal and support system as a nutritionist for enabling that side of the equation to kind of almost release the doors. Because if you have that kind of very difficult situation where it hasn't worked, they may have gone through IVF and that's resulted in, a poor result with the whole process, or there's been miscarriage, that kind of, it's like a scar tissue that starts building up and building up, and it becomes, almost scars upon their heart, really, that can be very difficult for them to release that positivity, that hope that something positive will come out of that.
And I suppose for yourself as well, learning to release it from yourself as well, because there's a lot of intense emotions around you. So
Mm.
I can imagine you've got to learn yourself to kind of go home and kind of shed it off and kind of carry on, especially if, you know, something hasn't worked for a client, or
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, definitely. Like, I guess IVF clinics, they constantly have to deal with disappointment if things don't work according to plan. And I guess if they took everything on board, it becomes very raw, doesn't it? And it becomes difficult for them to do their job in terms of what they've got to deliver, i.e., the drug protocol, the process of communication, and how that works, and then the end result. So you do have to. But there are times, obviously, when, I'm dealing with people who've had, I had a client in particular about a year and a half ago, 2 years, who'd had, I think she'd had 10 miscarriages. And she was working through Tommy's, the association, the charity that works with multiple miscarriage and all sorts of things in relation to that, in terms of looking at the immune system and how that might have actually heightened the response there for miscarriage and taking that through. So, it's difficult. And the interesting thing was, she didn't deal with the emotional side of things. I said to her, look, we really need to work with this, and I've got loads of people I can refer you on to. And she said, my therapy is understanding the process from a scientific point of view and bringing people like you on board who can help me and work through that. So it's really interesting. Every single case, Tamara, is completely different in terms of how you work with them. And you have to, at the end of the day, work through how they want to work and give them gentle support. You can't push them into a box and say, look, you have to start believing this in the way that I do, because they've lived through their own life experiences and they've dealt with their trauma in the way that they know best to deal with it. So, as a professional, it's very useful to kind of have a proactive kind of approach to that, but also be empathetic. You've got to have a real kind of balance between the two. And it's not for everyone working as a nutritional therapist that specializes in fertility and pregnancy, because you will have to deal with the emotional side of things, loss, miscarriage. And I'm train a lot of nutritionists as well, and they come to me saying it's my first miscarriage client. I'm absolutely gutted for her. It's awful. I feel so dreadful. And it's almost like the longer you go on with that, the more proactive you are, and the more you can kind of take the emotions out of the situation and give them some practical support to help them through that. I mean, it sounds a terrible thing to say. You do get more, sort of, you deal with it in a different way, I think, than the first or second time that happens. But there are definitely situations where you do get clients, and some of them have had, an incredibly harrowing journey to get a baby. And, that client in particular, luckily, she had a little girl about sort of 8 months ago now. And she was on such a strong regime of things, and we worked together with you know, the the gut, basically the gastrointestinal tract. There was some issues there in terms of, what was happening in her gut, and some dysbiosis there, and some parasites. And she also had, a really interesting general makeup in terms of her vaginal microbiome and her reproductive microbiome when she went for some biopsies of some of the material in the uterus as well. So it's just incredible how the body will stop something happening if there is a situation where it's not going to be productive for a baby to grow in that situation. Essentially the body will look at survival and inflammation first over reproduction, and it can stop that happening, from a very early stage in the cycle to almost at miscarriage level, at very early stages in miscarriage. It's interesting what happens, and working through clients who do have that situation, trying to pinpoint it is literally like looking for a needle in a haystack sometimes.
And that's a really interesting point that you just said, how the body will only let a child come to term if it's actually healthy enough to do it. And I think that's the hard part for people to accept. It's like, they feel like, why can't this happen for me? Why can't this happen? But then realizing that your body is making the correct decision with the circumstances, and to just trust that it knows what it's doing, that will, that it's hard to accept, but it's the truth, like you said. But you said earlier that, there are three parts. There's like food, lifestyle, and emotion. So you are the fertility nutritionist. So for people who haven't really seen how food, lifestyle can affect like your fertility, because some people probably think, oh, these things just happen, maybe it's genetic, there's nothing I can do about it, just give me some hormones and I'll crack on. How important is food and lifestyle to fertility?
Well, I guess you've raised a really interesting point there. 30, 40 years ago, we were thinking genes were the only way forward. And if you have bad genes, that's just a given, really. But we now know that the environment is what triggers those genes into action. So if you have poor lifestyle, if you have, if you're living in a very, unhealthy environment, if you are somewhere that's living in a very polluted place, I'm just thinking about the recent chemical spill in Ohio in the US at the moment, and how that actually is having an effect on the ground water. It's seeping into rivers that go all the way through about sort of 5 or 6 states in America. And you can see the effect that's having on smaller mammals there, and sort of fish and things like that. And, that's toxic. It's going into the air. It's causing all sorts of problems with people I'm seeing on the news. So we can see that, genetics will play a good part in that, obviously, in terms of how they can detox that. But if they are layering more and more things on top of that, like their lifestyle isn't particularly great to begin with, they're not moving their body enough, they're not eating the right things that are helping to support that whole system there to make them a little bit healthier, then definitely some of these things can trigger those genes into action and can sort of change things and make it more difficult, really. So definitely lifestyle does play a huge part. I would say it was one of the most important parts of that puzzle. I wouldn't say genetics is the be all and end all. You can have a really crappy set of genes, but if you work around that with, you know, increasing the possibility of making your lifestyle a little bit healthier with specific nutrients and working through detox and helping your body to improve that situation, you're making those genes a little bit more silent. You're not triggering them into action. And I think that's the most important thing to look at, because, you know, we have got these genes sometimes, and, you know, our genes are an example of us moving through different generations, surviving in situations where there's famine, where there's disease, where there's, you know, toxic chemical spills. And we can see that presented in the way some of the genes are actually changed in coming generations based around that. So we do have a mechanism for the cleverness of the body to actually change that based on what's happening in that generation. But what we can do to improve on that, and we now know based on the Human Genome Project and things being mapped, you know, 20 years ago in that situation, that we can actually change that by looking at, you know, how we live our lives, really.
Such a good point. And as nutritional therapists, functional medicine practitioners, that's what we've learned, and that's what we know, that, you know, you can have the genes, but the environment pulls the trigger. And that was just beautifully said. How that can come into fruition, how people can actually have more control than they think. And that's part of what we do, like help to empower people to get healthy and get well, and know that they have more control over it than, you know, than they first thought. How prevalent is infertility these days? How prevalent is it?
Well, it's actually a lot more prevalent than it used to be even 15 years ago when I started working in this area. It was kind of 1 in 8, 1 in 10. You know, way back in 2008 when I first qualified. It's now 1 in 6. So it is becoming, as I guess cancer was many years ago, 20 years ago, in terms of the possibility. So what's not happening at the same time, Tamara, is the taboo is not catching up with that. So people still hide their fertility journey from people. They still don't talk about it openly because there's still very much views and opinions that are given to people based around that, often well thinking and, you know, well meant, and, you know, through an air of kindness there. But sometimes, because that whole emotional piece from being told, you know, which we still have in schools, that you can get pregnant really easily, it doesn't catch up to the fact that when you're trying in your 30s and late 30s, that actually in most cases, if people aren't approaching this as if they were a project manager in terms of their life, their lifestyle, their health, looking at their genes and how they can actually improve the way their hormones are working, it does generally become one of those situations where they can add to that statistics themselves.
And I've learned in my 30s, I've learned to not ask women, oh, are you having kids soon? Are you not planning to have kids? In my 20s, yes, I was, you know, ignorant and didn't know what I was talking about. But now in my 30s, I'm like, don't ask someone that. Like, just, you know, that they could have any reason. Just don't go there if you don't know much about them. I have my own story to share that I wanted to talk about. I think it's very relevant for this conversation, and it kind of leads on to what we were talking about before we recorded this about fasting. So like I said to you, I specialize in fasting and helping women get in shape through fasting. But as we discussed before this, fasting is a no-go if you're looking to conceive. Or if you're pregnant, or, you know, breastfeeding or anything like that. So my personal story is I actually lived through the actual reason why you shouldn't be fasting when you're trying to conceive. I've actually lived it. So that's why I'm very precious with the women who are doing my programs. When I was trying to conceive my son, it was 2 years. It took me 2 years to do it. And I know looking back, that's probably not too bad compared to some other women, but 2 years, and it was fairly harrowing. I mean, for my first child, it took me 3 months. And so I just didn't expect to have it take so long with my second. And I had 3 miscarriages as well during that time. And I was like, what is going on? Like, I was healthy. So, like, typical. I was like, I'm exercising, you know, I'm got a healthy diet, you know, I'm fasting and I'm doing all this stuff. And I
Mm,
was like, why? I feel better than ever. Why am I
mm,
not conceiving? And I just didn't know. And this was back in 2019. Um, so I went to a dietitian and a doctor, and they both basically said the same thing. They were like, okay, tell me a bit about your lifestyle. Tell me a little bit about what you eat and blah, blah. And I was just like, well, I fast occasionally. Like, is that a problem? And they're like, yeah, that's a
mm,
problem, because if you fast too much and you're exercising, um, you're just putting your body through so much stress. I was also
mm,
very slim, because I was just not eating enough calories, because I was just taking it to
mm,
the next level. So, you know, having the not enough calories and just all the exercise, and my body was just like, hang on, this is not a safe environment to bring a child into. Like, there's not
mm.
enough food, there's not enough energy to go around. So,
Yeah.
um, that was basically, I didn't have any tests done or any, you know, hormone panels done or anything, but they basically said, stop fasting. Here are some
Mm,
progesterone tablets. And I
mm.
literally put on a few kilos, took the tablets, and I conceived like literally the next month. Um,
Yeah.
so I mean, that's my story. And I
Mm,
really want you to talk about fasting a little bit, because I
mm.
love fasting, but not for women who are trying to conceive. So can you just
Yeah.
explain why it's not a good thing?
Well, I mean, fasting is great. I'm definitely interested in that, and I do sometimes, if I have a client over the age of 40 that's gone through fertility issues and there hasn't been some success, there are some very small studies that look at it actually improving egg quality. So there's some statistics that look at longer term, sort of shorter term sort of fasting, and how that actually can kickstart that whole process where there's, sort of detoxing, getting rid of some of those situations where the body may be holding on to more things that need to be got rid of. And I think, it can be useful in those stages. And when I've worked with people who are going for IVF in their 40s, mid 40s, and they're saying, look, it's my last chance. I know this is kind of, last chance corral in that situation, but what can I do? And when I've done that with people who've gone through maybe one or two rounds before working with me, and then we do the fasting, it can really improve that situation and make that whole process better. But I think you've got to be careful, and exactly what you're describing there, Tamara, is what can actually lead to a condition called hypothalamic amenorrhea, which means that your body, from the pituitary, the main center that kind of commands when the orchestra of hormones start working to build follicles and then the eggs and everything starts from there, will send a signal to say you're, in famine effectively. So therefore, we're holding on to food. Reproduction's not going to happen there. And you see that when you do blood tests. You can see examples of that happening in some of the hormones, very low levels of FSH and LH, estradiol, maybe a little bit on the low side. But you can see some hope there in terms of the DHEA being higher, because that is one of those hormones that can actually indicate what your egg reserve might be potentially. So it's useful, I think, for certain circumstances, but I would never say, as part of a general approach, that fasting is something I would recommend unless somebody, really wants to maximize their potential, really, if they're a little bit on the older side. And again, not doing that on your own, doing that clearly with somebody who understands that process, who understands what your body's going to go through and how to actually help you through different stages of doing maybe a 7 or a 10-day fast there. Um, and whether it's something that is applicable for you. If you've got low blood sugar, probably not even in your 40s is a good idea to do that. Often when people are in their 40s, they're perimenopausal, so their blood sugar is a little bit higher. So again, that might be why fasting when you're a little bit older may work a little bit if you are just doing it on a short-term basis. basically what it does on a short-term basis when you're older is it just gets rid of all the dead material. Cellular renewal, we're kind of getting rid of some old things and starting from scratch. So it does help from that instance. But when you're actually younger, I think there are better ways to do that preconception approach by looking at your hormones, looking at, if you've got any diagnosis of any particular fertility challenges there, working through what's happening in regards to your microbiome. Because fasting generally does have a really, really interesting effect on the microbiome as well, which is obviously orchestrating a lot of how our health is in the body. So, yeah, fasting is good for certain circumstances, but I think preconceptionally, I'm not going to rule it out completely. But if you are kind of pushing that kind of approach, usually in my experience, it's type A women that will literally go for it hell for leather. They'll put the calorie count on, they'll start doing 5 to 6 times, CrossFit or spinning or whatever a week. And they also, do this very strict sort of eating regime in terms of when they can eat and when they can't, in terms of that, or they may fast completely by going on a water fast or something like that. So, if we think about it, it's putting your body under a tremendous amount of stress because it's used to having 3 meals a day. It does have a benefit for not having anything if you've got some issues with your microbiome and maybe some of the gut response there, for having less material going through that for a shorter period of time to help it heal. But it's all very much a case by case situation, Tamara. And I think generally preconception, it's about nourishing the body and enabling it to get to that point where it literally says, right, let's all pull all the shutters up, we're ready to have a baby now. Whereas the shutters go down effectively when you're fasting because the body sends that signal you're in famine, really.
I like to say that fasting is a really fabulous tool when you need it, but then when it's done, it's just put that tool down, just put it down, and then bring it back out when you need it again. It's a fabulous tool, but use it wisely, is what I usually tell my ladies. But so when it comes to the menstrual cycle, I remember when I was going through what I was going through, my menstrual cycle was about, it was about 34 to 38 days long. And I was looking online, I was like, low progesterone symptoms, low estrogen symptoms, high progesterone, high estrogen. And I couldn't find direct answers as to what was going on. And so it's so difficult to try and diagnose myself. So when it comes to the menstrual cycle, are there any key things to look out for a woman to see, okay, maybe you should get some help, or maybe this is happening with your body? Are there any things that women should be
Absolutely.
looking out for?
So key things are having a regular menstrual cycle. So anything up to sort of 33, 34 days can be normal for most women. It isn't textbook. Everybody's got a different kind of monthly situation in terms of their cycle length. But also when it comes to looking at your cycle and dividing it into those bits that you need to know, there's quite a lot of people out there that look at the specific hormones that are going through your body at certain points in that cycle. So early on, it's very much the kind of the build-up phase, and then it's obviously the settling down, the proliferation stage after you ovulate, and that can indicate how you actually put your energy into things. So when you're building up towards ovulation after your period, your energy levels do increase, and then after you ovulate, you're in that nurturing and nourishing position where progesterone is more prevalent. And it's about working through that yourself and understanding that you may want to do things differently in terms of social events and using your brain in applying things, because in the luteal phase after ovulation, your brain is more progesterone focused, dominant in that area, and it isn't necessarily as kind of on form really as it is when FSH and estradiol and LH is kind of in play. And I think when we're looking at the overall cycle, going back to what to look for healthy things, having a healthy bleed is important. So if you have a period that starts off and there's a lot of brown in there, it's very stringy, there's a lot of clots, generally that can be a sign of sluggish sort of tone in the uterus. It can also be a sign potentially that there's issues with lymphatic drainage potentially there. There
Sorry to
could
cut
also
you
be
off.
issues with, sorry, what did you say?
Yes, sorry to cut you off, only just
Mm,
because I just don't want to forget this part. But when you mentioned brown, I read in a book what that meant. It just meant that it was oxidized, meaning that it's been
mm.
sitting around for too long inside the womb. Is that correct?
It can be, but also it can be leftovers from the last
Yeah,
period that isn't
that's
kind of
it.
pulled
Yeah.
through effectively and then immediately got rid of. So what we're looking for in a good menstrual bleed is a very sort of bright, frank colour, almost like you've cut your finger. And I often say this with my clients. We're on period homework. We're looking at reporting back and telling me what that looks like every month. And does it pool at the bottom of the toilet, or is it like when you go to the toilet, it's like cutting your finger and dropping it in there? That's a good sign if it is more like that and there's less clots in there and it starts off immediately red and you have maybe a couple of heavy days and then maybe some lighter days. So we want to look for a minimum of 3 days of bleed there and maybe an extra day where it tails off a little. But what we're looking for generally is low clots and stringy material in that period to make sure that we can see an indication of healthy muscle tone in the uterus there, and also whether their circulation's good, because it may be that they have poor circulation as well, and there's some very sort of heavy periods, but it's very gloopy and very syrupy, the blood. So again, it can show that there may be some issues with muscle tone there as well. And also, in terms of Chinese medicine and people who work on the fertility massage side of things, they often touch the belly to see if it's warm. And if it's cold, then that can also be an indication that the circulation in that area isn't necessarily that great.
So interesting. And would that be linked to PMS as well? Do you look at PMS? The worse the PMS, then the worse the hormones,
Yeah, I mean that's
state the
more kind of
hormones.
relating to the half of the cycle called the luteal phase after you ovulate, and it's how well the first half goes. It's a bit like football. You can generally, if you build it all up in the first half, it can be better in the second half because you've actually got a few goals in there. So if things are really healthy, it's an indication of the month before and how well things have been approached. If your bleed is good, and you feel very energized towards your ovulation, and you're getting also a lot of cervical fluid as well, which is coming out, or cervical mucus as some people call it, which is something as you grow up that you're completely unaware of. You think, what's that jelly like substance in my pants, what is it? And actually that's a sign that estrogen levels are rising, and an indication, very much part of our grandmothers and great grandmothers era, where they would have passed that information about it being the right time to try for a baby. So those levels of clear kind of cervical mucus or fluid that you can stretch between your fingers between sort of day 10 and maybe day 16 or 17, depending on when you ovulate, are also a sign that you are heading towards that ovulation period. But PMS, once you've ovulated, it's how well that progesterone level is maintaining in that half of your cycle. And if it starts off and you've only got 7 days of that good level and it starts to drop, that's when you start to feel maybe that PMS is dominating that part before you start your period. It's never after the period. You often feel really grumpy just before your period starts, and then it's a revelation always when the period starts. You feel all right and you go, of course, every month it's like that.
You're like, there is nothing wrong.
No, absolutely,
Oh.
that person's chewing was not that annoying. It was just that period 1 or 2 days before that feel good progesterone, and that's the hormone that dominates in together with estrogen in pregnancy, which is why women tend to feel quite good in pregnancy,
Mm.
and tend to keep wanting to have babies, because progesterone is really strong, and it's that hormone when it drops, that level of, wow, it's dropping. I want to hold on to that feeling when the PMS starts to come in a bit more. So we're also looking at things towards the end of the cycle there. Things like spotting can indicate that the progesterone is dropping too quickly, and any spotting before a period starts is really interesting in terms of how your cycle is maybe not as healthy as it could be. And also mid spotting as well in the cycle. Spotting at any point in the cycle can be an indication that you maybe need to go and speak to your doctor and get some tests done, get some early day 3 tests to look at the main follicular hormones, and then looking at doing a progesterone test to see what your progesterone is 7 days after you ovulate. The sad thing is, Tamara, most people have such a short or long cycle. They call it the day 21 test for progesterone, and it isn't always on day 21 that there's the best time to do that. That would only be if you had a 28-day cycle, and that would be 7 days after ovulate, if you ovulated on day 14. So that's why I use things like basal body temperature testing to look at your cycle. I use, OvuSense, which is a really great fertility monitor to help me to understand, and the client as well, what's happening in their cycle. And we can use things like this to really gauge when that day 21 test is, because it will be 7 days after your ovulation. But it's not just that, that's just one test that can tell you what's happening at day 7. When you look at something like BBT monitoring, basal body temperature monitoring, and OvuSense, if that drops like steadily from day 7, and you only got 7 days of decent progesterone in that luteal phase, you know that generally that's not the healthiest for sustaining a pregnancy as well. And you mentioned yourself getting on progesterone tablets. That is one way of boosting that situation. But I think, as I'm a functional nutritionist, I like to see, before I start popping hormones in for your body to rely on something synthetic to go forward, that actually it is down to progesterone. That's just the actual realization of what's happening in the body. It could be a root cause of something else like stress. It could be some inflammation in the body as to why at that point the progesterone is leaving the building. So it's always useful to work with a specialist with fertility that understands the cycle and tries to help you to educate yourself through that whole approach, rather than trying to do this on your own. And this is what makes me laugh really with a lot of my clients. They kind of circle me for about 4 years, gaining lots of information from the Instagram account, then going, oh, well, I've done all these mushrooms that you've given me, Angela, you talked about on Instagram. I have used this supplement that you talked about, and I've done a test. And it's so much easier to go and get a nutritional therapist to help you through that, because if your washing machine broke down, you wouldn't go on in YouTube and start trying to work out how to work that. But I think it's such a taboo that women feel so embarrassed that they can't do this themselves, because that's what society's geared them up to do. They spend hours on Google, Dr. Google, trying to work through what's going on with them, when actually the best thing to do is always just speak to a specialist who works in fertility and can understand and educate them around where there may be some issues in the body that actually need some further investigation.
But also for a lot of women, I think they don't know when they should go and see someone, because I remember when I was going through, I didn't see any professionals for over a year after I could conceive, because apparently online they say if you haven't conceived for a year, then you should go and see someone. But then even then, each month I had this fresh optimism every month, and I was like, oh, I didn't like this
sure.
time. And before you know it, 2 years has passed, and you're just like,
True,
God, this hasn't happened in 2 years. And for me, I just didn't know that I needed the help. I just thought we
that's
were
half the thing, isn't
unlucky.
it?
Yeah.
But I think it's really rooted in that social taboo of the fact that you're a woman, you should be able to do this. If you can't, the shame is kind of very subliminal. And I think in other circumstances, women are much better, like for instance, for asking for directions if they get lost, going, let's bring TaskRabbit in to do something because I can't put the shelves together. I can't cook this, so I'm going to get a takeaway. I think there's definitely instances where women go, yeah, let's cut out the middleman or woman. Let's go straight to do this with somebody else's professional situation. I think is definitely rooted in that. And I feel really sad about that situation because, in most circumstances, you know, people will go to professionals to ask their help, because they just say, I haven't got time for this. I haven't got time for a year or two to pass, because fertility generally does go down, you know, from periods of maybe sort of 39 to 43. You've got, you know, where things drop a little. And then in your sort of mid 40s all the way up to 45, it drops drastically, you know. And I think because we're sitting on that, oh, I just need another month, maybe it will happen now, we lose
Exactly.
time,
Yeah.
you know.
That's
And I've
exactly
got
the
people
mind
come to me
frame.
that are
Yeah.
so kind of, ah, oh, I haven't got time for this, Angela. I haven't got 3 months to work together. And I just say, well, this is
Exactly.
how we have to do it,
Yeah.
because we don't know what we don't know at the moment. We need to work through what is actually causing this inflammation that is maybe upsetting your cycle, and you have some low levels of hormones that can be explained with you know, oxidative stress in the body, really.
You hit the nail right on the head. I think the time issue as well is women are in,
Mm,
like, couples are in such a rush to do it, to conceive,
yeah.
and it's almost like going to professional almost slows everything down, because what if this person tells me I can't conceive for another 6 months
Mm,
because you've got to go through this
yeah.
special program, and like, I think
Yeah.
that can be scary for people. So
Yeah.
if someone was listening right now and they're taking some time to conceive and they're not sure whether they should go and see someone, so just say they think, okay, maybe I should go and see someone. What are some um, main things that someone could do today that could help their fertility, like food wise and lifestyle wise? I know this is a big question, but are there any
Yeah, sure,
key
sure. I mean,
things?
doing a food diary yourself, because we are completely unaware what's going in our mouths sometimes when we're watching the TV, how many times a week we're having alcohol, how much protein we're having, how many starchy processed carbs we're having a week. So I think just going through a diary for a week, including the weekends, because sometimes that's a different approach to food, and just then looking at, you know, putting it into a program that actually assesses the amount of carbohydrates and the amount of proteins generally, can give you more of an idea of the amount of vegetables you're having on a daily basis when you think you're super healthy. I've lost count of the amount of people that say we're really healthy. We have 3 vegetables in our evening meal. I have a sandwich for lunch and I have Weetabix for breakfast, you know, and that's the approach where they think that's healthy, because, you know, big food industry is kind of pushed out these kind of cereal
Yeah,
based approaches,
like Healthy
and,
Start.
you know, wheat based sandwiches that have a few vegetables in them, that actually what they're doing is being healthy, when actually what we need to do is really break that down by them looking at the amount of macros in their diet, the fat, the carbohydrates, and the protein levels, and the amount of vegetables they're having on a daily basis, particularly with women, which they're terrible for not having enough protein, which again are the building blocks of building new life, you know, and repairing the body. So those are the things I would say are basically a starter for 10. And then looking at the lifestyle, looking at, you know, things that they put on the body, you know, other things that they use chemicals wise, you know, how toxic is their beauty regime, looking at the air in their house, you know, do they use an air filter? Are there, you know, toxins in the house that may be causing inflammation? There may be mold or damp in the environment which the body is breathing in, and it's creating mycotoxins which can be very, very toxic for the body and the immune system to get rid of. So there's lots of things I go through really as a functional nutritionist in my first consultation that assesses their lifestyle and their diet and their emotional kind of approach to things, and their motivation as well going forward for changing some of these things, because there's no point you going in there being, you know, very sort of, well, let's cut all these things out, and then saying, well, I'm not really prepared to do that. So you've got to kind of assess what their level of motivation is in terms of changing the lifestyle right from that first conversation that you have. So hopefully these are some of the things that you can do, and get them to do, you know, a basic hormonal test, you know, at the early start of their cycle on day 2 or 3. I'm getting them maybe to do a progesterone test. But again, these are some of the things that can, if you don't have that assessment from that, can actually be quite detrimental to their emotional approach to this, because if they get something themselves but then doesn't have a professional to talk them through it, they can often then go down a deep black hole in terms of, well, I'm never going to get pregnant. Look at these levels, everything's out of balance. Dr. Google's useful, I think, but it can be quite difficult when you're looking at things you can do yourself. So I would always say, start that conversation with your doctor if you've been trying for a year and, it hasn't happened. Even sooner, if you're over the age of 39, I would say 6 months. Go up to the doctors, have a chat with them and say, can I have some blood tests to assess my fertility? Possibly even get a scan on day maybe 9 or 10 of your cycle to see what's happening with your follicles, see whether you're producing enough. Look at your womb lining, see if there's anything there that might be obstructing something. Like, for example, endometriosis. You can do MRI scans now if you've got families issues with that. You can also do, a basic scan to assess what's happening with your level of follicles on your ovaries as well, and look at the womb lining as well to see health of that. So these are all things you can kind of do through your doctor, or you can go private. You can arrange a scan privately. Luckily, in this country, we can do walk-in scans there, and that can give you more information to then go and see a nutritionist who specialises in fertility, have this information to hand, and then you're taking control of what's happening in your life, and you're not just saying, well, every month it's not happening and I don't know why, and then going down a deep hole and sort of worrying about it and letting your intuition kind of go off in millions of different places of, maybe I've got this disease, or I don't know what's happening, as it generally does in most women. Being a woman myself, I can obviously account for that myself. When something's not working, you literally go round and round the houses in terms of why. And it's always good to then, take control back by doing something, and approaching it in, for example, you would do planning a wedding or planning a marathon, or all these things that take time to get to that level with an understanding of it. And I always say this, people plan their wedding more than they do the fertility, and working up to a marathon. These are two things that they generally do, and maybe MOTing the car and looking after that. And I think it's generally psychologically because we're told that if we try for a baby, it's going to happen immediately. And if it doesn't, I think that shame can be quite difficult for people to deal with. And it takes them a long time to get back into, okay, I need to reach out for some help here. I need to admit this isn't happening. And once I do that, the door's open and there's a whole load of professionals that can help you on that side. And it is a lot more common than we're led to believe. 1 in 6, 1 in 8 couples is a really, really high amount of something in terms of, it being an issue. And I think it really needs to push up the agenda in schools now to try and let, young women, young men actually understand that this is something, cantering up on the horizon that we need to be aware of.
I think that's so important, like everything you've just said. And I really love your approach when you say, if it's if you're training for a marathon or planning a wedding, you'd have a team of people helping you. And because going through this can be really lonely, like when you're sitting alone and you've just had a negative pregnancy test again, and that overwhelming sadness, you're just like, I have to wait another month, and like, what's happening? And just like looking at things on Google, and it can be so lonely and it can be so devastating. But it's really interesting because you were mentioning food, which I get, the vegetables, the protein, which is really important, building blocks of life, fats, carbs. But then when you go on to like skin creams and the lifestyle, like the mold in the home, I can imagine people thinking, okay, how does that affect me though? So is there any way, because recently you've been talking about something incredible on Instagram, which I'm so interested in. And actually I want to talk to a mold specialist at some point on this podcast because I'm so interested. How does lifestyle factors like that, external, affect your fertility? So even just looking at mold, for example, how can mold in the home cause infertility? Like how?
Well, I mean, one of the most important things to think of when we think of mold is it's older than time. The whole kind of use of mold, its sole purpose is to degenerate something down
Yeah.
so that it can survive. It will go into something that is a living material, including wallpaper, paper, carpets, any kind of surfaces that have water on it, which is a medium for it to grow, and damp in most environments which are humid, and then cold and damp, and grow that situation. So, from a human perspective, that place where it grows the best is the nasal cavity and the lungs, a very, very important place for growing that, because it's almost like an ecosystem inside the lungs and the nose. It's the right temperature, and that's where you breathe in mold spores and they become, more toxic, 20 times more toxic with mycotoxins that then become, the purpose of them is to obviously to try and survive and to degenerate the organism they're in. So mold generally in the house, if we think about back to Victorian era and all those kind of damp environments where there was no heating and people lived in those places, there was a lot of obviously disease spread and a lot of respiratory issues that children died of. And we've got that more recent thing in the UK where that little boy, that 2-year-old little boy, died from a very, very sort of mold infested house. It showed pictures of it, and the younger you are, and the nearer you are to the mold on that level, really, the more potentially you can be breathing in those mold spores. And that's why his parents were able to kind of manage that themselves. But him as a little boy, very difficult. I read the interview with his mum, and it sounds like his mum actually had issues with mold even before she had the baby, because I think she had to deliver him a little bit early. So again, it can have implications in terms of, preterm babies, and obviously then the lungs, if they're going back to the house and it's new lungs kind of breathing those things in. It is something that I'm so glad is now up on the agenda. It's a really horrible situation that a little boy had to die in these circumstances, but people generally are kind of mold deniers. You talk to people generally, even members of my family have been like, oh, don't be silly, it can't be that bad. It can get inside your brain. It can reduce down your mitochondrial ability to actually function, which is very important for egg health. And one thing we didn't discuss earlier, I'm talking about all these tests for women, it affects sperm health as well. So there's quite a few studies looking at it. And the agricultural business has known about mold and the contamination from feed and the environment for 100 odd years, in terms of the fact that if you give it to animals to feed off, that can result in miscarriages in cattle. Um, Likewise for obviously the sperm and things like that. So it does have a big effect on sperm as well. And I think that's where doing full tests for men as well, in terms of sperm levels first, and then looking at general blood tests for them as well, to see if there is something that is affecting their immune system, because effectively that's what's going to happen. It will kick the immune system into a point where it's bringing out that natural killer cell approach, because something is threatening the life of the organism. So that's when the body brings these things on, and it can be, quite sneaky in terms of the way it approaches things, because it will attack the nucleus of the cell, it will attack the mitochondria, so it stops the body being able to regenerate itself and to support that. And you can see that with a lot of people that do have mold toxicity or mold illness. It presents very much like long COVID or ME, or severe sinuses or lack of energy, really bad kind of detoxability, things like loss of hair, weight gain. It can mimic so many things, Tamara, that it's really difficult to kind of nail it down and go, oh, I can tell that's mold, until you do something like a mycotoxins urine test, because the bladder is one of the areas where mold can actually be, a receptacle for that. So when you pee out some mycotoxins and you test those, you can see from that if you are producing a lot of mycotoxins and, kind of fermenting that in the bladder, really. And then what those species are as well, because then if you know what those species are, you can then approach things in a different way in terms of working through how to get that out of the body, really.
I think the fact that you're talking about this and putting it out there is so, so important, because if there's somebody who thinks, well, I think I'm doing everything right, like I've gone to the doctor,
Mm,
he can't figure out what's going on, I'm eating well, I'm staying healthy, but I still don't know what's going on.
mm,
What you're talking about here with mold is just another avenue. It opens another door of possibility. It's like, okay, so maybe you might want to look at this, like just
mm.
maybe you want to have someone round to check out your home to see if
Yeah.
there is any mold growth, because you can't always see it and you
Mm,
don't always know that it's there. So
yeah.
sometimes you need to have a professional to come and check it out. And I
Yeah.
think it's so important that you're kind of bringing this up, because it's kind of opening another door for somebody to
Mm,
explore. And also just lifestyle, like you said, things they're putting on their skin, and maybe environmental toxins like the plastics, and like you could really go down a
mm,
rabbit hole with the environmental toxins. But it's people need to know about it because it's
mm.
there, and it could
Yeah.
be one of the reasons why you're having difficulty getting pregnant. um I mean, what I wanted to basically, I wanted to kind of do some quick fire questions just to kind of
Mm.
finish. So first of all, what are your thoughts on birth control pills?
Well, I mean, they use them in IVF to control the cycle. So they will put you on that if you're in a long protocol and then take you off it when they want to start the whole process. So, from that perspective, they are quite useful for helping to control that. In terms of with, the fertility perspective, I have a different view. I think sometimes using the pill has been used as a form of, gaslighting in a way because it says it's liberated women to allow them to do these things. But actually, not understanding their cycle has stopped them having more control over how they actually work through life, in terms of what I was talking about earlier, the follicular phase, in terms of energy and what's happening in the luteal phase after progesterone hits is probably, if we hadn't had the pill, we'd have got a lot more in modern society based around women in the workforce working around these things cycle wise. I think it's useful for if you've got, a particular condition that may mean you need to kind of stabilize things out from the brain to the ovaries, but it can also trigger a lot of people's diagnoses as well. So, for example, you may have pill induced polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Mm.
which, if you're on the pill for a period of time and it doesn't kind of send that signal backwards, that's how it works, really. So, useful for some things, not necessarily great if you are on the fertility journey and you've been on it long term, really.
Right. And just finally, how long do you think a woman should be spending kind of cleaning up their diet, cleaning up their lifestyle in preparation for conception? How long do you think it takes to get your body into good condition?
Well, in terms of the information behind that, they say sort of 90 days for both sperm and egg health, because that's how long it takes for that cycle for sperm health to kind of develop. And also in terms of eggs being pulled into the primordial pool, really, to help grow that through the follicle and for that. So it's looking at, emotional detoxing, kind of, skincare and beauty products and what you're using on your skin, what you're breathing around your home, and also what you're putting, what you're eating in your body. So all these things are very much a bespoke situation. You can have somebody working around that can really help you if you have certain things that come up in some of these tests, to then go in there with a more specific situation where you can get, higher levels of energy if you work through certain mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, or if you have certain immune conditions, we're working through reducing that inflammation to allow your body to then open the door to supporting further and more healthier fertility.
Right. This topic is so huge. I feel like this could be a 2-hour conversation, 3-hour
It could.
conversation. What I want people to know is your Instagram, because I'm always on Instagram and I see that you're on
Mm,
Instagram a lot as well. What I want people to know is that the information on your page is so good. You talk about medicinal mushrooms. You've been talking about them recently and how they're good for fertility, and that's a great avenue to go down. You talk about mold, but then you talk about hormones and all the things that women need to know about fertility. So I just want to
mm,
urge people to kind of to follow you and to get clued up on fertility. using the information that you put out there. So is there anything that you want to say, just to kind of wrap up? Is there any final thoughts or
Well, I
anyone?
always say what
Yeah.
we've just talked about, Tamara, is, we need to do that preparation work. Like I said earlier, when you are getting married, you don't just go down the town hall, set off and, get your gear on and just go. You have that preparation period. It's a long period in for that. So I think if you are, able to do that, I would say at least a 3-month preparation period, if not longer, to get your body into that fitter, kind of more healthier position is the best way to approach this, and look at all of those things we've discussed, in terms of cutting out some of those more toxic things. There's things you can't avoid, like the air we breathe and, the way things happen in the environment that we have no control over. But there are some things you really have got control over that you can choose that help you to get into a much healthier state, which you can see responses from when you're doing blood tests. You can see things improving, and then also doing things like monitoring your cycle, because timing is so important for trying for a baby, and you completely could be getting it wrong and missing that window. So that's a really important thing, looking at understanding your cycle a bit more, looking at some of these fertility monitors that are quite useful, to look at basal body temperature and trying to understand your cycle, and that will give you an insight into your body to help you obviously through those stages of trying for a baby.
Love it. And how can people find you and get more information?
So Instagram is where people mostly find me. I'm at Fertility Nutritionist. There's lots of information on there, and if you want to obviously look at my website, my clinic is www.ourfertilitynutritionist. So if you look for that, that's the way to contact me. But you can obviously get in touch with me via Instagram as well, and set up a session where I have a free 15-minute session where I go through options to work with people if they want to take things more to a bespoke level, where it's more kind of tailored to your needs, and not as opposed to, wading through online and all the forums and all the things that are available that can actually be more relevant to that particular person and not relevant to you. So bespoke, I think, is always the way forward, because we're individuals, and I think we often look at this group mentality of being this certain type through things like the human design or astrology and all sorts, and actually we're an individual. So it's about, celebrating the fact that you are the most individual thing on earth. There's never going to be anything like that again. So again, we need to look at a plan that works around that.
Love that. Really great. Oh, thank you so much for all of the information you've shared. It's been so, so valuable. And I know it's going to help a lot of couples out there. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. And I hope we can do this again soon.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for bringing me on. I really appreciate you and asking me all these questions. It's really helpful to talk through these things because it does reach more people. And I think that's the idea, really, isn't it?